Tawa kakyo awiak.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our presentation, What is Home? Wisdom from nêhiyawêwin. My name is Selena Bifon, and I am an urban Métis residing in Amisquashi, Muskegon. I am an undergraduate student at McCune University and co-author of this work.
Tanse nitiga sankeheosko muskego sagai knik ochinia amiskuchi uskayagan niwigin migwich. Hi, my name is Cheyenne Grey Eyes. I'm from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation over in Saskatchewan, and I reside here in Edmonton.
We're both really excited to explore some preconceptions of home with you today, but first we'll start off with a smudge and a land acknowledgement.
So for anyone who has not smudged before, this is an Indigenous practice that we use to ground ourselves. And in today's conversation, we're just asking for help and guidance. So with that, I'm gonna light the smudge. I want to start with a land acknowledgement too, that here in Amisquachiwaskayagan or Edmonton, we are on Treaty 6 territory, which is traditional lands of the Nêhiyawêwin, the Anishinaabe, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Dene, Iroquois, Inuit, and Nakota Sioux. And
we want to honor the traditions, cultures, and the languages, practices, ceremonies of all Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. And we encourage you, if you are not in Muskegon right now, to learn what tree you're on and whose people's land that you are residing.
Yeah, there's a great amount of like beauty and variation here in like Treaty 6. So right now throughout this paper, we're just going to be talking about Cree understandings and perspectives. So that's kind of where we're coming at it from. But here on Treaty 6, there are lots of different teachings, lots of different elders that come from different communities that carry different knowledge than we do.
Yeah, so throughout this paper, we are going to explore the knowledge within nêhiyawêwin, specifically surrounding our language practices, matriarchy, our kinship, and as well as our relationship to the land. And I really like this quote, the Cree language brings us together. And really that's what this paper is about.
Yeah.
It's about exploring our worldviews as Indigenous peoples and letting the knowledge from this language bring us together, and in this housing context also to provide some insight to what that bringing together could look like based on these worldviews.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, like with housing, we often talk about like Indigenous people in the deficit. We talk about a lot of negative statistics and all that. And so throughout this presentation, we wanted to have people think critically about their perspectives and where their perspectives are coming from. Are they coming from a colonial perspective? Are you coming from a different cultural perspective because you're from somewhere else? Are you coming from a different Indigenous perspective as well? So like throughout this presentation, the point is really to break down these negative stereotypes and break down some of these deficits and talk about the ways that we are strong, that our systems are amazing. And so we're hoping to go through and describe them and kind of relate them to concepts of like housing and home. And we'll be using nêhiyawêwin, our language, to help show that connection. All the connections can be shown throughout the language, like she said, resurgency. So yeah.
So we will talk in the deficit mode just briefly,
just for a little bit,
just to bring a little context to why this conversation is important and why these worldviews need to be explored. So Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented in the homelessness sector in Canada. So we are more than 8 times more likely to become homeless compared to the general population in urban centers. with 6.97% of Indigenous folks experiencing homelessness compared to 0.78% of the general population. So that's a huge number if you're considering how many ethnicities we actually have in across Turtle Island here. So it's very significant. This really also is driven home when we consider how many Indigenous children are in foster care. So Indigenous children make up to 52.2% of all children in foster care, even though they're only 7.7% of the general population. So again, literally over half of children in care are Indigenous. So this is also interesting when you look at how many homeless youth actually have interactions with the child welfare system. So again, almost half. And although we aren't necessarily talking about causality here, we can see that a lot of Indigenous youth are growing up in foster care. A lot of them are becoming homeless. And this is more of a systemic issue. You know, there's some underlying causes here for this.
Yeah, and continuing, we'll be going through all the different kind of assimilation, or not all of, but a lot of Canadian assimilation tactics and how we got to this point and how it's gotten this bad. So
we'll start with just a brief little primer on the colonial impacts on Indigenous homelessness. So since its inception, the Canadian Project has relied on settler colonialism. So this process is ongoing. It involves the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories and lands, and this is to make room for settlements from the imperial mainland. So over the years, this has looked like in Canada, the reserve system and the pass system, which these were forced upon our peoples specifically to make way for settlers coming in. I think that Jesse Thistle does a great job in outlining some of the dimensions of Indigenous homelessness. So we actually got these graphics from one of his really great reports, which we have linked in a resources section afterwards. If you want to check it out, it's really, really great work. Oh yeah, also, small disruption from that thought. If you have any questions for us, please hit them in the chat. We're going to be here online, able to answer some questions for you. So while you're watching, feel free to keep that in mind. So to get into this a little more, so there's this historic displacement with this reserve system that is forcing Indigenous peoples out of their lands. And they are now put onto these small bits of land that are generally the least profitable. So lands that are not as fertile, lands that aren't right close to urban development or any major economies. So bands were often coerced into going into these reserves. A lot of it was signed over through treaty, but unfortunately the treaties were often written in English, misrepresented to the people who were signing them, as it was not in their language. And, you know, there was that mutual trust with the signing of the treaties for some of them, and that was not honored. Other treaties were signed under threat of coercion, you know.
Like Poundmaker, Chief Poundmaker, and the group that he was leading under were coerced through starvation, and they were literally like chased across the prairies into signing treaty. And then again, historically here in Edmonton, we have the Pappas Chase people who did sign treaty and then were forced out illegally afterwards.
So treaty is often a flawed system, not honored by the Canadian government, but it was a tool that legitimized this land theft in the eyes of the Canadian government. It is also worth noting that Indigenous peoples were heavily policed from leaving or moving about these reserves. So that was the pass system. It was in place from 1884 into the 1940s, but it has continued into the contemporary moment with the over-policing of Indigenous bodies as well. So something to think about. This historic displacement really shows itself in our contemporary times, as it has resulted in you know, defragmentation of a lot of our nations, and this continuous structure of settler colonialism is ongoing, and it's continuously severing people from their lands and their relationship with that land. So that's part of this homelessness aspects that are just ingrained in even the formation of Canada. So also we want to talk about spiritual disconnection and cultural disintegration and loss. So how a lot of these assimilation tactics were specifically mandated by the government. So 60 Scoop, residential school system, and child welfare system. So these systems took our children away, separated our people, and continue to do so into the current day. This leaves intergenerational trauma and cultural genocide for the first peoples of Turtle Island. So they had a very heavy impact on our families and our society, our structures. It interrupted the transmission of our knowledges and our traditional family systems by separating us from each other, our homes, our land, and our culture. So our spiritual connection relies heavily on this connection to our lands and our kinship and community. So this break from our spiritual and cultural ties with our family and ancestors and communities leaves us to feel rootless, this disconnection within our identities, because we don't know who our ancestors are. We don't know our family histories. A lot of us didn't even know we were Indigenous until we were old enough because of these systems. So we really want to hit on the sense of feeling rooted. That is what home is for us. This encapsulates a connection to our indigeneity. So finding out who our ancestors are, learning our languages, learning our traditions, building that family and community, and knowledge of our medicines and ceremonies. And this interconnection with all of creation. Now this is really the spirit of this connection. It's all my relations. This is also displayed in the word Wokotowin, which basically translates into kinship, but it's also this aspect of all my relations. So it's this interconnectedness between every being, plant, animal, the land, and this principle is such a deep part of our spirituality. And when we're disconnected from these systems, that we should have all of our relations with these strong ties, it can be really damaging and also result in this homelessness, this not having a home.
So what is home, right? That's really the root of what we want to talk about today, because, is it just a house to you? Is it just where you live? Is it a place without physical bounds? Is it your city as a whole? So how is your concept of home, how is that connected to the land and the people around you? So, there's no one way to define family. Depending on where you come from, you'll think of family differently. Who's included in that family, or that definition of family will mean differently for different people. But here in Canada, we've mostly seen colonial narratives of family. And so we'll go into later on in the paper, like how that's been enacted on Indigenous peoples and how that's been influencing them still today. And so as someone who's listening to our presentation today, we're just asking you to reflect on, how do you conceptualize home? Is there any underlying narratives that you still hold on to that, maybe this presentation will bring to light for you? So with that, moving forward, we're going to be talking about the Cree language, and I'm just a baby Cree speaker. I know so little Cree, but every Cree word that I've been taught, or Cree lesson, has always been centered around a teaching from an elder. And they use the language to kind of build this picture of all of these connections that are spread all throughout the language. And these words, they connect terms that connect to the teachings, and hopefully that'll make sense as I go through a few more words with you guys. You'll be able to see how the Cree language really shapes the Cree worldview. They go hand in hand. So it's really important that when we're talking about the nêhiyawêwin or the nêhiyaw worldview, we're also talking about nêhiyawêwin, because our spirit is built into the language, if that makes sense. For a lot of people who have been disconnected from language, and then begin to reconnect, myself personally, oftentimes we reflect on the fact that hearing the language that we have no way of understanding, it feels like you're returning home in a sense. Like it's very comforting. It's like a memory that was lost a long time ago.
I definitely remember that. I remember one of my first sweats, and the elders will speak in Cree when doing their prayers. And it is just that feeling, really. That is how you would describe it, as being at home.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that it was surprising to me how good that felt.
It feels familiar, even if you've like never heard it before in your life. And for some people, that feeling is really prominent. And the reason it's so prominent is because we're an oral culture, right? Is that all of our histories were held within these stories. And even beyond our actual literal histories, it was teachings that, help us walk that traditional lifestyle as a Cree person. And the elders say that language is the key to connecting to teachings that have been lost, because you can find them within the language.
Language, it has all of these connections, and especially in nêhiyawêwin and many Indigenous languages, there's really that connection as well to the land. A lot of these words actually convey knowledge about that land, about living on that land, and what that environment is like.
Actually, I want to tell you a story about this. Actually, something cool that my elder Francis Whiskey Jack shared with me is down here in what's kind of like southern Cree area, I suppose. April is considered our frog moon. But when you go up into northern regions of Cree, May is actually the frog moon. And what's so interesting about that is because the language shifts depending on the region. And it's because the frogs thaw out at different times, right? So up in the north, it thaws out later in May, and down south, earlier in April. And so the language works around that. It's relational to the land, like you were saying.
So it's so important for us to keep these languages because of all of the knowledge that's actually embedded within them. And that just speaks again to being able to, for a lot of us, relearn the worldviews that we have lost through colonization. And going on this, the impacts of colonization on our our language, I should say. We, in residential schools, we were beaten if we spoke our language. So there's this disconnect now where a lot of the younger generations, we can't speak our traditional languages, and our elders sometimes cannot speak English either. So there's now a disconnect within the family, within the home. And
well, definitely when residential schools, when we're talking like in the 1920s and even earlier, like in the first 40 or 50 years of history of residential schools here in Canada, that's really where we saw the language disconnect, right? As kids being socialized in English and then coming home and not being able to receive any of these teachings that are in Cree by elders that only speak Cree. And then nowadays, like within my own family, even though people do understand Cree, because of the trauma associated with residential schools, they don't speak it. So even though, maybe the language would have still been maintained in the family, it's because of the colonial trauma that it stops it almost altogether.
So that brings us into our discussion of matriarchy, which, there's so much that we can learn within the nêhiyawêwin about matriarchy and what that meant for our society. So Cheyenne is the resident better Cree speaker since I am even more baby. So I'll let her kind of dive into this a little bit more with some of her teachings.
And so most of these teachings come from my late Nokumpan Roxanne Tatusis, who really focused on empowering our Indigenous women. So a lot of these teachings come from that. And so first of all, what is matriarchy? What does it look like? A lot of times, like, is it the exact opposite of patriarchy? Like, I would argue that it's not really, right? Because patriarchy is about power and hierarchy and structure, whereas the matriarchy that was practiced here on Turtle Island was a lot more egalitarian, right? It really had to do with people taking care of the people that lived in the community together, right? It had nothing to do with this power dynamic, is that we all make decisions. And it goes back to that term that you brought up, right, wokotowin, right, a sense of respect, right? If we're all related and we're all related equally, then why would we have power and hierarchy and structure? And it's these hierarchies and these powers that create, you know, some of the negative impacts that we see within patriarchy in like in a colonial sense.
And actually also can be attributed to the houseless sector too. And, you know, like the issues that we're seeing with houselessness, homelessness, that sort of thing in the contemporary moment as well.
Yeah. And so, you know, we're seeing like when we're talking about matriarchy, we're talking about more egalitarian communities. And then before colonial contact, there's a lot of evidence to show that women held status, and two-spirited people held status and roles such as like leading ceremonies and healers and working for your communities. And also like raising the younger generation. So there's a lot of responsibility there that is still honored within our culture, that women and two-spirited people play a very important role on our concepts of family, and it's shown within our language as well.
Yeah, like that reverence for that maternal role.
Yeah,
that is so important to just like the whole fabric of the society. And we also want to mention that Indigenous conceptions of our genders aren't really within that binary. When we're talking about the role of women, we're not necessarily saying you are like female specific. You are more so carrying that role, that responsibility in the community, that caregiver kind of role.
Yeah.
And you can also, whatever your gender, carry out other roles in the community, more of like these warrior roles, or as Two-Spirit do, have both of these roles that you fill. And this is also represented in the language as well. Cheyenne, if you want to.
Yeah, and it's kind of the colonial structure that has put the binary on these sorts of things. And so it's also, I also want to point out too, that the binary between like men and women in that sort of sense, that very restrictive binary, you don't really see that in Cree. It's very much like a genderless language, if that makes sense. Like you can say an entire sentence in Cree about a specific person and you'd have no idea what gender they are, because it really doesn't matter what gender they are. It matters what role they play in the community, what they bring to the community. And so while English kind of forces us into these binary words, we just wanted to explain that, right? Because it's a really complicated concept. So I'm gonna get into some of the Cree. So I hope y'all are ready. Do some Cree.
Okay,
all right. Okay, so the first word that we're going to do is usni, usky, and agawimau, usky. Okay, hopefully those all sounded really similar to you. Maybe you couldn't even tell them apart, and there's a reason for that. So usni is rock, usky is the earth, and ogawimau, or sorry, usni is rock. Yeah, usky is mum, another word for mum. There are several words for mother. Yeah, but that's usky, and then agawimau usky, which is mother earth, which is like basically the combination of those two words. And it's kind of showing how, you know, we are connected as women, are connected to the land. And it's kind of shown within the language, like the similarities. And then, okay, so another word I want to go through is, if you guys remember how I introduced myself, right? I said nêhiyawêwin, which doesn't really translate to my name is. It more directly translates to I come from. And it's because of this word nitsi, which means belly button, meaning that like I came from my mother. So if it makes sense in Cree, you're saying I came from my mother and then my name. That's what you're saying, right? And this nitsi term is connected to the nêhiyawêwin, which is another word, another way to say mother. And then lastly, there's nihki and nêhiyawêwin again. So nêhiyawêwin again and nihki. They sound really similar, and the root terms there is connected between home and mother. And so we can kind of like follow Cree train of thought, if that makes sense. So, you know, we have our belly buttons, which is the proof of our life, right? We came from a womb, we were birthed, we have a belly button, and that connects us to our mothers, and that's how we introduce ourselves. And then the Cree, again, connects motherhood to the earth, Uski, Usini, right? And then we get this story, this beautiful story that Roxanne Tachusis used to tell me, and it's three connecting words more so. Isqueo, which is the word for woman, and iskoteo, which is the word for fire. And then the third one is kotawan. But I'll explain why those are significant is because they say within our creation story that the earth already had the ability to give life, right? It could produce plants and animals, the ability to give life, but women couldn't. And in the creation of women, Creator took fire from the star and put it in the woman. And they share that connection, that life fire, if that makes sense, with Mother Earth and you within yourself. Okay, now I'm going to introduce one more word, hopefully I haven't lost you, is kotuan. And kotuan means home fire. And it's that word for the fire that rests inside of you. And so Cree kind of puts women at the center of the home by calling it kotuan, that home is made around the woman because she makes life, she brings the children in, right? She creates the home and takes care of the fire by taking care of herself. There's this a treaty saying, I think it's by Alexander Morris, during the conception of Treaty 6, during the signing of Treaty 6. And he said, as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the river flows, right? You've probably heard that one before? Yeah, and then something that most people don't know is when it's talking about when the river flows, it's talking about that birthing process when the water breaks on the land, you know? And so what it's really saying, the river flows, it means as long as Indigenous peoples are still being born on Turtle Island, then the treaties stand, right? And it was so important for our elders to include that piece of motherhood into the treaties to represent the continuation, because we need our mothers to continue the line, to continue the teachings. And going into that, they're the ones that socialize us, right? They're the ones that, you know, often they are the first ones to sing us our first lullaby. They're the first sounds that we hear when we're born. And so our mother's voice and our mother's teachings are very important to socializing us and growing us into who we will become. And hopefully that will be like strong nêhiyawê people, but for many people that connection was lost because they were disconnected from their mother.
Right.
Yeah. And all of those, you know, colonial enterprises, I suppose, or what's the assimilation tactics, sorry, that were talked about before, residential schools, 60 Scoop, CFS, they all take children away from their mothers. Yeah, so we've already mentioned Makotwin a few times, but you know, not everyone knows how to speak Cree right off the bat. So I'll say it again, Makotwin means that we are all related, right? Not just literally related, but we're also talking about land, peoples, animals, plants. Okay, we've covered that. Third time, we're not going to cover it again. But it's Makotwin that helps us understand concepts of family, right? Because if we're saying, oh, we're all related, then we would expect Cree narratives to have a very broad sense of who is included in family. And that's exactly what we see kind of shown out in the language. So, and oftentimes, like the Western term extended family, if that makes sense, like your aunts, uncles, cousins, like extended family beyond your nuclear family. So those are the terms we're going to be using, like your nuclear family structures and then your extended family structures. So within nêhiyawêwin, we often see inclusion of what would be extended family members in very close and personal kinds of terminology. So let's break them down. I know you can't really see it like super clearly. Okay, so the first term that we're going to be talking about is this term right here, nêhiyawêwin, which we have already talked about, right? It means mother. And then this term right here, nêhiyawêsis, sometimes termed nêhiyawêsis or nêhiyawsis. And that's our term for auntie. And you can kind of see how they sound really similar to each other. And so nêhiyawêwin means little mother, right? So instead of calling her auntie, which is an entirely different term in a Western sense, we're just calling her little mother. She gets the same, almost the same name and respect that our mother does. We also see that in the uncle terms as well. So this entire line right up here, if you have really good eyes and you can see this, or you can Google it for yourself as well, be in our references too, you would see that they are all super related terms. Like they sound very, very similar. And this is because our aunts, our uncles, and our parents are all meant to parent us, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like just like she's your little mother and he's your little father, it means that your parents would trust them so much to raise you.
Our aunts and uncles, in a sense, really have that increased responsibility of raising the children.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in these lower terms right here, hopefully you can see, these right here are sibling terms. I have a really hard time reading this. Nia, nemesis, and nistes. So right, yourself, Nia, nemis, your sister, and nistes, your brother. And then if you look at these other terms here, these are also, in a Western sense, we would call them our cousins, but if you look at them in Cree, they're all sibling terms, right? And so within the Cree language, again, we can just kind of see how there's not really a term for extended family. We don't have the separation like this furthering. If they're your cousin, then they're your brother or sister. If you were raised together, they're your brother or sister. It's a lot more fluid. It's not exclusionary. It can include a lot of people. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later too, but you can claim anyone as your sibling. If you claim that person as family, that's it, they're family. And
this just goes to show how in our traditional communities, everyone was raising their children. It was not just the responsibility of mom and dad. It was the responsibility of literally the whole family. And this extends into the grandparents as well, but that just those tight connections within this community of people who are all related to one another.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so next, I want to go into adopting culture, because I think Cree adopting culture is really, really interesting if you get a chance to read about it and learn about it. But one of our most famous examples is Chief Poundmaker. He was adopted by the Blackfoot chief, Chief Crowfoot, after Chief Crowfoot had unfortunately lost his son, and he had adopted Poundmaker into the Blackfoot community, taught him the language, taught him the customs, and raised him, loved him like his own son. And he did, and he called him son. That adoption, it's not like a son, he is a son. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in the English language, we fall into that so easily, like a son, but in Cree, there wouldn't ever be like, oh, you're halfway to being claimed as a son. You are or you aren't, mm-hmm. if that makes sense. And these traditional adoptions are really quite important, because after Poundmaker had spent many years with his Blackfoot tribe, he then returned home to his Cree tribe, and was able to raise them. And he's known as a chief that had an immense amount of wisdom. And it kind of shows how our traditional adoptions facilitated a lot of learning. It was like you would go to another community to learn about them, to learn a different perspective, and then you go home being able, well, in Poundmaker's case, being able to lead, mm-hmm. right? If he hadn't been adopted by Chief Crowfoot, who is also, was known to be an amazing leader, would we have seen someone else? So adoption is very important in terms of like sharing culture, sharing language and knowledge, but also fostering cooperation, right? If you have someone that can speak the lingo between both, but not only the language and lingo, but you are able to understand from both perspectives, that person becomes a very strong mediator. Yeah. And that's very healthy for communities.
And peaceful as well. Like that's how you build a strong society, right? Is having all those interconnections and those relationships.
Mm-hmm. And within Canada, it's really been unfortunate to see, but adoption has been used against us. for those who are familiar with the 60s scoop, you could call that adoption, but it wasn't traditional adoption. They were removing children from the socialization that was so integral to their self-esteem. And children were growing up in countries far away from their original roots, having no idea that they were even indigenous. And so this adoption cycle, you know, that adoption cycle creates trauma, but our traditional adoption does the exact opposite. It facilitates health and healing and love and family and connection. Whereas the adoption cycles that we've seen here in Canada have only been negative.
So now that we've talked a little bit about, you know, kinship and matriarchy and these relationships that we have with each other and how we relate to each other in our societal systems, we'll now talk about how that relationship extends into the land. So connection to our lands is integral for nêhiyawêwin. Our lands, they are based out of our how we sustain ourselves, and this is where our ceremonies and our cultures and our languages, this is where it comes from. It's so embedded within the land. And
we're always from, you know, for those who have been able to have culture for their whole lives, often are taught at quite a young age how to have reciprocity towards the land, that we are always grateful for all the things that the land gives us and that we are constantly giving back. And again, with Wokotowin, right, is that we take care of everything that is related to us, because everything moves in a circle. So if you treat something badly, that will come back on you because you put that into your environment. And so we are taught to take care of the land around us because it takes care of us. And the Cree people, you know, they understood this when they signed Treaty 2, that you couldn't own land, because how can you own something that will continue on long after you've gone?
Yeah,
you know,
and you know, this was exemplified in you know, them saying that they would share the land up to the depth of a plow as well. You know, really bringing home that this land is for us to sustain ourselves off of, but it is not ours.
Yeah, you can use the land, but you cannot own the land. Yeah, exactly that. And it's the land itself that makes us Indigenous peoples in the first place. I mean, we have been stewards of this land for millennia, and we have lived in harmony with everything around us. And we have a beautiful picture up of the buffalo, and like my late Kukum would say, was that the buffalo was and is still our education, right? The buffalo walks the land, knows the land, creates the paths that we can traverse all the way across Turtle Island. The buffalo is known in our traditional ways as carrying a lot of knowledge and being able to walk in and out of these spiritual spaces and to bring knowledge back to their people. And we can always learn something from the buffalo, if that makes sense. I wish I could go into it more, but we're running out of time. But if that's something that you're interested in, please throw it in the chat, ask questions about that. Yeah, and you know, talking about home and housing, I hope we've established by this point that home and housing are very different things.
Yeah, completely different. So on one hand, you've got housing as a physical structure, but that really doesn't have the same dimension of what a home is. A home is that connection to your identity, your community, your culture, your language. That feeling that when I went into my first sweat of being at home, when I heard my first language, or the Cree spoken for the first time. Yeah, I can't tell you the difference of what that would feel than say me entering, you know, like an apartment building.
Right. Yeah. It's this, and you know, when we talk about rootedness and what it means to be rooted in the land, oftentimes the first place that my mind goes is the millions of people, of my ancestors who walked on this very land before me. You know, that sense of rootedness of being like, I have been here for thousands of years. And there is such a sense of pride in that. And a lot of the people that are existing, Indigenous peoples that are existing within these systems and are feeling a sense of rootlessness, you know, may desire to have that connection. And it's really important that when we're talking about resurgency, we're talking about connection to the land. Because for some of us, me especially, that connection to the land was super important to me coming back to traditional teachings and traditional ways of knowing.
And it is also worth mentioning, you know, when we think of like houseless folks and define home as only having a house.
Yeah.
You know, we're really excluding a lot of our ancestral ways. Like a lot of our tribes were nomadic. If we were on the land, we were home. It wasn't always having to be within a house. And when you understand, you know, current day homelessness as well, not everybody is seeking just that one fix, that one physical structure, especially if it disconnects them from that community, that those things that really make a home that they could even find on the streets too. So when we're talking about housing policy and what we can do to bring these worldviews in is recognize that, you know, housing first, it's a good policy, but it doesn't really solve that problem of having a home. We need to be building these homes and these multi-generational communities if we want to see changes in these terrible statistics that we were previously talking about. You know, we need Indigenous-led and Indigenous worldview informed policies, structures that can help solve this issue. You know, that's kind of our major conclusion here as well, is that
I'm like thinking if I want to add anything, but that really is the root of it, is that, you know, the key to thinking about home in a different way. You know, you can read all the papers, you really can, but it really just comes down to listen to people that, you know, are surrounded in this housing issue. You know, listen to women that are affected by the CFS, listen to people, Indigenous people who live in the River Valley, like of Edmonton. That's a really prominent space for some people. And, you know, it was mentioned by our boss a while back too, that sometimes Indigenous people who live, like, for example, again, say out in the River Valley, they are home. They don't claim to feel any kind of rootlessness because they're still maintaining traditional practices of their ancestors. And sure, it might be difficult, but actually listening to people surrounded with the housing issue, you'll get a sense of, well, one, who wants housing? Where do they want to be housed? And, you know, can we facilitate something beyond just housing?
Yeah. Can we create these communities, these families, really? And can we help connect people back to their traditions, their language, their ancestors? Because so many of us are disconnected right now. And that's what Indigenous resurgence is really all about. We know our people best as well. We can't have just colonial worldview informed solutions
to problems created by colonial interaction, right? We have to, and you to be able to fix a lot of the issues that we're seeing within Indigenous communities, we have to, again, return and reincorporate everything that was tried to be, you know, taken from us.
From colonialism, from the impacts of assimilation. And, you know, we even see now communities that have been able to form these strong connections and come back to ceremony, and that, you know, they're strong. Very often they're very resilient, but it's we're still undergoing ongoing oppression. So
hopefully this presentation gave you a lot to think about in terms of what normal people or most people would consider to be a very simple topic, home, but to us, all of this runs very deep. We're very grateful to be here and have the opportunity to share with you. Hi.
Thank you. Hi.